Somewhere in Texas, in the late summer of 1944, there was a sound that did not belong, the slow drag of iron against dry ground, steady, rhythmic, impossible to ignore, and every man who heard it felt it before he understood it, because chains have a way of speaking even when no one else does, and that morning, under a sky so wide it made everything feel smaller. A group of German women stepped down from the back of an army truck into Camp Hearn, their boots touching dust that hadn't seen rain in weeks, their shadows sharp under the hard sun, and among them was Anna Weiss, 26 years old, a nurse once, now just another prisoner number, her frame thin from months of rationed meals, her hair pulled back without care, her face unreadable, not hardened, not broken, just still, and around her ankles, the chains moved with her, metal links catching light, then dirt, then light again, each step measured not by choice but by weight. And no one spoke as they walked, not the guards, not the workers nearby, not even the wind seemed willing to interrupt, because there was something about the way she carried herself that held the moment together, shoulders straight, eyes forward, not searching for sympathy, not asking for anything, just moving, and across the yard, standing near a fence line worn smooth by years of cattle brushing past, was Jack McKenna, a rancher who had spent most of his life reading land instead of people. A man who understood drought by the color of grass and trouble by the way animals moved before a storm, and he watched them come in the same way he watched everything else, quietly, without announcement, his gloved hands resting on the top rail, his hat low enough to shade his eyes but not hide them, and at first, it was just another delivery, another routine, another piece of the war that had found its way into Texas without asking permission, but then the sound reached him, not loud, not sharp, just constant, iron on earth, step after step, and he didn't look away, not when one of the women stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, not when the chain caught and pulled her balance just enough to slow her down, and it was Anna, though no one there knew her name yet, and she didn't cry out, didn't look around for help, she just paused, adjusted, and kept moving, as if dignity was something she refused to set down even for a second, and something in that small moment shifted, not in the camp, not in the rules, but in him, a quiet recognition that didn't come with words, just a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat, and for a long second, he stayed where he was, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching the distance between what was necessary and what was happening close in until it felt too narrow to ignore, and the chains kept moving, marking each step, each breath, each second that passed under a sky that did not care who wore them and who did not. The lines slowed as they reached the center of the yard, where the dust had been pressed flat by years of boots and work, and the guards began calling out instructions in measured voices that carried without force, directing the women to stand in formation, to wait, to be processed like everything else that passed through that place, and Anna stopped when the chain allowed her to stop, her feet settling into the ground as if she had already learned not to expect comfort from it, and the metal rested against her ankles with a weight that was no longer new but not yet accepted, and around her the other women adjusted in small ways, shifting their balance, brushing dust from their skirts, exchanging brief glances that said more than any shared language could carry, and still no one complained, not out loud, not even in whispers, because the habit of endurance had already taken root, and a young soldier approached with a clipboard, his uniform clean, his expression focused on the paper. More than the people, reading names he could not pronounce, assigning numbers that would be easier to manage, and when he looked up, it was only long enough to match face to record before moving on, efficient, practiced, untouched by the sound that continued at his feet, and a few yards away, Jack stepped off the fence line and onto the open ground, his boots pressing into the same dust that clung to everything in that place, each step unhurried. Not drawing attention, not asking for it, just closing the distance between where he had been standing and where the moment had settled, and he did not speak at first, did not interrupt the process, but he watched closely now, closer than before, the way the chain shortened each stride, the way it dictated pace and posture, the way it turned movement into something negotiated instead of natural, and when Anna shifted her weight again, the metal caught briefly against itself, a small resistance that made her pause, not in frustration, not in anger, just in calculation, and she adjusted without looking down, as if refusing to acknowledge the thing that held her, and that was when Jack reached for the edge of his glove and pulled it tighter against his hand, a small motion, almost absent, but it marked something settling into place, and he looked toward the nearest guard, a corporal standing with keys clipped at his side. A man who had been following orders since the day he arrived and saw no reason to do otherwise, and for a second, Jack said nothing, the air between them filled only by the distant hum of insects and the quiet shuffle of boots on dirt, and then he spoke, not loud, not sharp, just clear enough to carry, asking a question that did not sound like a question, about the chains, about why they were there, about whether they were needed, and the corporal answered with the kind of certainty that comes from routine, explaining that it was procedure, that it had been done before, that it would be done again, and he did not look at the women when he said it, only at Jack, as if the answer lived somewhere above the ground and not in it, and Jack listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged, and when the explanation ended, there was a brief space where nothing moved, where the camp seemed to hold its breath without knowing it, and in that space, the difference between what was allowed and what was right became visible, not as an argument, not as a debate, but as a simple line that had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it, and Jack did not step back from it, did not turn away, he just stood there, looking at the chain resting against Anna's ankle, then back at the guard, and the decision, when it came, did not arrive with force, it arrived the way the morning had, quietly, without asking permission. The corporal did not move right away, not because he refused, but because the request did not fit into the shape of the day he had been following, and his hand hovered near the keys at his belt as if waiting for confirmation that had not been spoken, and Jack did not raise his voice or repeat himself, he simply held the moment steady with his presence, standing close enough now that the dust from the women's steps had settled around his boots, and for the first time, the corporal glanced down at the chains, really looked at them, not as equipment, not as procedure, but as something attached to a person, and that small shift was enough, just enough, for his fingers to reach the ring of metal and lift it free from his belt, the keys catching the light for a brief second before falling back into shadow, and the sound of them was softer than the chains, but it carried in a different way, sharper, more deliberate, and a few heads turned. Not all, just enough for the change to begin. Moving through the space like a ripple across still water, and Anna felt it before she understood it, the subtle change in attention, the way the air seemed to lean in, and she did not look up, did not break the line of her gaze, because whatever was happening was not something she expected to belong to her, and the corporal stepped forward, his movements careful now, measured in a way they had not been before, and he knelt slightly. Not fully, just enough to reach the metal at her ankle, and, for a second, his hands paused, not from hesitation, but from the unfamiliar weight of doing something different in a place that rewarded sameness, and then the first lock turned, a small, precise click that cut clean through the quiet, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it was clear, unmistakable, and the chain loosened just enough to change the way it rested against her skin, and Anna felt it, the difference. Immediate and undeniable, though she did not move yet, did not test it, as if waiting for the moment to prove itself real, and the second lock followed, another click, another release, and the metal slipped away, falling the short distance to the ground with a dull, final sound that did not echo but settled, and no one spoke, not the guards, not the workers, not the other women, because something had already been said without words, something that did not need explanation, and the corporal moved to the next woman, repeating the motion, key, turn, release, each action becoming easier, more certain, as if the first had opened more than just a lock, and Jack remained where he was, watching, not with satisfaction, not with pride, just with the same steady attention he had carried from the fence line, and around them, the camp adjusted in silence, men who had been working paused without being told, tools held midair, conversations left unfinished, all of it giving way to the quiet recognition that something simple had shifted. And Anna finally moved her foot, just slightly, a small step forward without resistance, without the pull that had defined every movement since she stepped off the truck, and it was not a dramatic gesture, not a statement, just a step, but it carried a different weight, or rather, the absence of one, and she did not look at Jack, did not offer a nod or a word, because whatever had passed between them was not an exchange, it was not something owed or returned, it was simply done, and in that moment, under the same wide Texas sky, the space between people looked different. Even if nothing else in the camp had changed. The chains lay where they had fallen, half buried in the fine Texas dust, their shape already losing definition under the weight of the ground, as if the earth itself had no interest in remembering them, and for a few seconds longer, no one moved to collect them, no one stepped forward to restore what had been undone, and that absence of reaction settled deeper than any command ever could. Because it meant the moment had passed beyond control and into something quieter, something shared, and the women stood differently now, not dramatically, not with relief written across their faces, but with a subtle shift that could only be seen if someone was looking for it, the way their feet placed more naturally against the ground, the way their balance no longer negotiated with weight, and Anna felt it in the simplest way possible, through the space between her steps, through the absence of resistance, through the quiet realization that nothing was pulling her back anymore, and she did not test it with anything more than what was necessary, she simply stood, then moved when instructed. Because habit does not leave all at once, it lingers, it waits, it watches to see if change will last, and across the yard, the workers returned to their tasks, but slower now, as if the rhythm they had been following had been interrupted in a way they could not fully recover from, tools meeting wood, metal, and soil with a fraction less certainty, conversations resuming in lower tones, not out of fear, but out of awareness. As if something unspoken had entered the space and asked to be respected, and the guards adjusted too, though none of them would have said so, their posture unchanged, their instructions still clear, but their eyes moving differently, lingering a second longer, observing instead of overseeing, and the corporal who held the keys no longer rested them casually at his side, his grip firmer now, not out of authority, but out of recognition that what they opened mattered more than he had considered before, and Jack stepped back without ceremony, returning to the edge of the yard as if nothing had happened that required acknowledgement, his boots leaving the same shallow impressions in the dust, his hands settling once again on the worn fence rail. But he did not lean the same way, not quite, because once a line has been seen, it cannot be unseen, and the distance between him and the camp no longer felt as fixed as it had that morning, and Anna, as she took another step forward in line, allowed herself the smallest glance downward, not to check, not to confirm, but simply to register the absence, the quiet, where there had been sound, and then she lifted her gaze again, forward, steady, unchanged in the way that mattered most, because nothing about her posture asked for recognition, nothing about her movement suggested gratitude, and yet the space around her carried something new, something that did not belong to rules or ranks or routines, something that moved with her without weight, and above them all, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, the same as it had been before, the same as it would be after, holding everything beneath it without judgment, while on the ground, something small had shifted just enough to be remembered, not in reports, not in records, but in the way people would stand, and look, and choose, the next time a moment like this came without warning. The day did not stop for what had happened, because places like this did not pause for moments that could not be measured or recorded, and yet the rhythm of it moved differently now, not slower in any way that could be counted, but altered in a way that settled into the edges of everything, and as the women were led toward their assigned barracks, the ground beneath their feet felt the same, dry and firm. But the way they walked across it carried a quiet change, each step no longer negotiated with weight, each movement belonging fully to them again, and Anna walked in the middle of the line, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. But inside that stillness something had shifted, not relief, not gratitude, just an adjustment, as if a part of her had been returned without announcement, and she did not look back at the yard, did not search for the man who had spoken, because whatever had happened did not ask to be witnessed twice. And ahead, the barracks stood in long rows, wooden structures faded by sun and time, their windows opened to let air pass through, carrying the faint scent of pine and dust, and the guard at the door gave instructions in a voice that remained even, directing them inside, assigning bunks, explaining routine, and the words landed as expected, orderly, predictable, but the space they entered felt different than it would have an hour earlier, not because it had changed, but because they had. In a way too small to name, and too real to ignore, and inside the room was simple, rows of narrow beds with thin mattresses, folded blankets at the foot, a table near the wall with a pitcher of water, and metal cups that reflected the light in dull, uneven shapes, and one by one, the women moved to their assigned places, setting down what little they carried, adjusting sheets, sitting carefully as if testing the surface before trusting it, and Anna reached her bunk and paused for a second, her hand resting on the frame, feeling the solid wood beneath her fingers, and then she sat, her feet touching the floor without obstruction, without interruption, and for the first time since the truck had arrived, there was no sound of metal marking her presence, no reminder with each movement, just the quiet of a room filled with breath and distance, and across from her, another woman shifted, her eyes flicking briefly to Anna's ankles before looking away, not in curiosity, not in question, just in recognition, and outside, beyond the walls, the camp continued its routine, voices carrying across open space, boots moving along worn paths, tools meeting work with steady rhythm, but there was a subtle hesitation in it all, as if something unseen had asked everyone to reconsider the weight of what they carried and what they chose to leave behind, and near the fence line, Jack remained where he had returned, his posture unchanged to anyone passing by, his presence blending back into the shape of the place, and yet he did not resume watching the land beyond the camp as he usually did, his attention resting instead on the space within it, not searching, not tracking, just holding the awareness of what had already happened, and he did not expect anything to follow, did not look for acknowledgement or consequence, because the act itself had been complete, finished the moment the metal touched the ground, and in that completion, there was nothing left to claim, nothing left to explain, only the quiet understanding that sometimes the difference between what is done and what is right is no wider than a single step. And once that step is taken, everything after it carries the memory, even if no one speaks of it again. Afternoon settled over the camp with a heat that did not press but lingered, the kind that made time feel stretched without changing its pace, and inside the barracks, the air moved slowly through the open windows, carrying the distant sounds of work and voices that rose and fell without urgency, and Anna sat on the edge of her bunk for a long moment before lying back, not to rest, not to sleep, but to feel the stillness without interruption, her hands folded loosely over her stomach, her eyes tracing the wooden beams above her as if memorizing their lines. And every so often her foot shifted slightly against the floor, a small, almost unconscious movement. Not testing, not checking, just existing without resistance, and across the room the other women moved in similar quiet patterns, adjusting their spaces, folding what little they had, speaking in low tones that did not carry far, because there was nothing to announce, nothing to explain, only a shared understanding that something had changed and that it would be held without being spoken aloud. And outside, the sun began its slow descent, the light softening just enough to take the sharp edge off shadows, and the work details returned in measured lines, boots brushing dust in steady rhythm, conversations resuming in fragments that no longer felt entirely routine, and near the water station, two soldiers paused longer than necessary, not speaking about what had happened, but not speaking about anything else either, as if the space between words had become more noticeable than the words themselves. And the corporal with the keys stood for a moment at the edge of the yard before moving on, his hand brushing the ring at his belt, not checking, not counting, just aware in a way he had not been that morning, and Jack remained near the fence until the light shifted enough to draw longer shadows across the ground, and then he stepped away, not toward the barracks, not toward the command office, but along the outer edge of the camp where the land opened wide and uninterrupted, his boots following a path worn by habit. And he walked without hurry, his gaze moving across the fields. Beyond the wire, the same fields that had always been there, unchanged, steady, indifferent to everything inside the fence, and yet the way he looked at them carried a different weight, as if something within the boundary had altered how he measured what lay beyond it, and he stopped at a post where the wire met a corner brace, resting his hand there for a second, feeling the rough grain of the wood under his palm, and he did not think in words, did not frame what had happened into meaning, because it did not need to be explained to exist, and back inside the barracks, Anna sat up again as the light shifted across the floor. The angle of it changing the room without moving anything in it, and she stood, walking a few steps to the window, her movement unmarked by sound, her presence no longer announced by anything but the space she occupied, and she looked out across the yard, not searching, not expecting to see anyone in particular, just observing the place as it was, and for a brief second her gaze passed over the fence line where Jack had stood earlier, though he was no longer there, and she did not pause, did not linger. Because whatever had connected them did not require recognition to remain real, and as the day moved toward evening, the camp settled into a quieter rhythm, one that held the memory of the morning not as an event, but as a shift, something that had entered without force and remained without demand, changing nothing that could be written down, and everything that could be felt. Evening arrived without announcement, the heat loosening its grip on the ground as the sky shifted from hard blue to something softer, stretched thin with light that faded slowly across the horizon, and the camp followed that change in quiet ways, movements slowing, voices lowering, the day folding into itself without ceremony, and in the barracks the women prepared for the night with the same careful rhythm they had learned to carry through everything. Folding blankets, washing hands in metal basins filled with water that had already begun to cool, each action deliberate, contained, and Anna moved among them without drawing attention, her steps light against the wooden floor, her presence steady, unchanged, and yet the absence of sound where there had once been iron gave her movement a different quality, something less defined by interruption, something closer to silence, and she paused near the small table by the window, pouring water into a cup, watching the surface settle after the brief disturbance, the reflection of the fading light bending slightly before returning to stillness, and for a moment she remained there, holding the cup without drinking, as if listening to something that did not have a voice, and outside, the guards rotated positions along the fence line, their silhouettes moving through the dimming light, routine unchanged, but their pace carrying a subtle awareness that had not been there before, a hesitation not in action but in presence, as if the space they occupied had gained weight, and near the far end of the yard, the corporal paused again, his hand brushing the keys at his side, the metal resting differently now, not heavier, not lighter, just noticed, and he did not look toward the barracks, did not search for confirmation of what had been done. Because the result did not require inspection, it existed whether he acknowledged it or not, and beyond the fence, Jack stood once more at the edge of the land, the open field stretching out under a sky that was losing color with each passing minute, and he leaned slightly against the post, his posture relaxed but not distant, his gaze moving across the horizon without focus, not searching for anything, just taking in the stillness that settled after a day that had carried more weight than most. And he thought briefly of the sound from the morning, the steady drag of metal against ground, and how its absence had reshaped the silence that followed, and he did not measure that change, did not try to place it within rules or reasons, because some things did not belong to explanation, they belonged to recognition, and back inside the barracks, Anna finally raised the cup to her lips, drinking slowly, the water cool and plain, grounding in its simplicity, and when she set it down, she moved to her bunk, sitting for a moment before lying back, her eyes open to the ceiling once more, tracing the same lines she had studied earlier, but now in softer light, and her foot shifted slightly against the floor, not from habit this time, not from adjustment, just from the natural movement of a body at rest, and she closed her eyes without tension, without expectation, because nothing in that day had asked for anything from her, nothing had required her to change, and yet something had been returned quietly, without condition, and as the camp settled fully into night, the sounds faded one by one, footsteps giving way to stillness, voices to breath, until only the low hum of insects remained, steady and constant, and under that wide Texas sky, the place held its silence differently now, not empty, not waiting, but full of something that had no name and no need for one, something that would remain long after the day itself had passed. Night did not arrive all at once but settled in layers, each one dimming the edges of the world until the camp existed more in shape than in detail, and the barracks held a quiet that was not empty but shared, the kind that forms when many people breathe in the same rhythm without needing to speak. And Anna lay still on her bunk, her eyes closed now, not in sleep but in a rest that allowed the day to move through her without resistance. And every so often a sound would pass through the room, a shift of fabric, a soft exhale, the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cooling air, and none of it carried weight, none of it demanded attention, because the absence of something heavier had already changed how everything else was heard, and beyond the thin walls, the guards walked their routes with measured steps, boots pressing into ground that no longer held the memory of iron dragging across it. And one of them paused near the corner of the barracks, his gaze moving across the line of windows where dim light rested against glass, and for a moment he stood without purpose, not checking, not counting, just present, before continuing on as if nothing had interrupted his path. And farther out, where the fence marked the boundary between order and open land, Jack remained awake longer than usual, not out of restlessness but out of a quiet awareness that had not settled yet, and he stood beneath the wide sky. The stars beginning to show in scattered points of light, distant and steady, and he listened. Not for anything specific, just for the way the night held the place differently than the day had, the silence deeper now, but not empty, and he thought again of the sound that had filled the morning, how constant it had been, how easy it would have been to ignore, to let it remain part of the background of everything else, and how once it was gone, it revealed itself as something that had never belonged. And he did not attach meaning to that thought, did not shape it into a lesson or a reason. Because it did not need either, it simply remained, like the night air moving across the open fields, and inside the barracks, Anna shifted slightly in her sleep, her body settling deeper into the thin mattress, her breathing even, uninterrupted, and her feet rested naturally, without tension, without memory of weight, and somewhere in that quiet, something within her had eased, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named. Just enough to allow rest without resistance, and the other women slept in similar stillness, their presence filling the room without sound, each carrying their own thoughts into the night, each holding the same unspoken understanding that something had been returned without being asked for, and the hours passed without event, the camp unchanged in its structure, unchanged in its rules, and yet the space within it held something different, something that moved quietly between people without being seen, shaping the way they stood, the way they looked, the way they chose. And as the night deepened and the stars settled into their places above, the camp did not forget the day, it simply absorbed it, letting it become part of what would come next, not as a memory spoken aloud, but as a presence that would remain, steady and unseen, long after the sound of chains had disappeared into the dust. Morning returned the way it always did, without memory, without hesitation, the first light spreading across the Texas sky as if nothing had happened the day before, and the camp rose with it in quiet sequence, doors opening, boots meeting ground, voices beginning again in low tones that carried routine more than urgency, and inside the barracks, Anna opened her eyes to the same ceiling she had traced the night before, the same beams, the same stillness. But something within that stillness felt settled now, not new, not unfamiliar, just present in a way that did not ask to be questioned, and she sat up slowly, her feet finding the floor without pause, without the instinct to adjust for weight that was no longer there, and for a moment she remained seated, her hands resting lightly at her sides, feeling the simple fact of balance, of movement unbroken. And then she stood, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, stepping into the day with the same quiet composure she had carried before, but without interruption, and around her the other women moved in similar silence, preparing for the day with small, deliberate actions, none of them speaking about what had happened, because it did not belong to words, it belonged to something else, something that had already taken its place. And outside the yard filled again with movement, the guards taking their positions, the workers gathering tools, the structure of the camp reassembling itself with familiar precision, and near the fence line, Jack stood where he often did in the early hours, his hands resting on the worn wood, his eyes moving across the ground inside the camp before lifting toward the fields beyond, and for a brief second, his gaze passed over the space where the chains had fallen, though there was nothing there now, no mark, no imprint, only dust pressed smooth by time and footsteps, and he did not linger on it, did not search for evidence, because the absence itself was enough, and as the women stepped out into the yard, Anna among them, their line formed without hesitation, without resistance, and when they began to move, the only sound that followed was the natural rhythm of steps on earth, steady, even, uninterrupted, and a few of the guards noticed it without turning their heads. The difference subtle but clear, the space between sounds no longer filled by metal, and the corporal with the key stood at his post, his hand resting near his belt, not from habit, but from awareness, and he watched as the line passed, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, but his attention present in a way that did not seek control, only understanding, and Anna walked past without looking at him, without looking at Jack, because whatever had shifted did not require acknowledgement to remain real, it did not belong to exchange or recognition, it simply existed, carried forward in the way she stepped, in the way the ground received her without resistance, and as the day moved on. The camp continued as it always had, work assigned, tasks completed, time measured in hours and effort, but beneath that structure, something quieter remained, shaping the space between people, guiding small choices that would never be written down, and above it all, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, holding everything beneath it without judgment, the same sky that had watched the chains fall, the same sky that now watched their absence, and in that quiet continuity, the meaning of the moment settled not as an event, but as a standard, something unseen but present. Something that did not raise its voice, but raised something else, something that would remain long after the day itself had passed, carried not in memory alone, but in the way people chose to stand, to look, and to act when the moment came again.